Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Little Acts of Kindness. This will be Part 50, Chapter 50, entitled His Classmates. Namuri smiled as she looked at Tensei. He was getting better, and in another few days he would be allowed to go home on the wheelchair. Tensei yawned, even as he responded to her question. Yeah, they came and visited me. I even got introduced to some of my brother's friends, Todoroki and Midoriya. Tensei fell silent for a moment, eyes losing focus. A moment later they refocused, but she could tell her friend was in a losing fight against his tiredness. Is Midoriya safe now? Namuri pursed her lip. I think so. I don't know the entire situation, but she had her suspicions. If it was what she thought it was, well, that was why she decided to have a chat with Midoriya. Shota and Hisashi are looking after him. Good. That's good. Namuri chuckled. You should see the two with him. I did a bit. It's a bit obvious, isn't it? Not for those two. How long do you think it'll take for them to realize? Tensei laughed. I suspect a while. How's his home situation? I don't know, but Hisashi and Shota haven't done anything about it yet, so it can't be too bad. Tensei grimaced. You mean not bad enough that they'd be justified in taking him away? Namuri gave her own grimace, thinking about the social workers and the admittedly low bar they had for what was deemed acceptable. Tensei's eyes fell closed, and they didn't reopen. After a minute, Namuri turned and started to leave, believing Tensei was asleep, but just as she opened the door, she heard him mumble something that turned her blood cold. I'm glad we're free of the itching. Her head snapped around, and she stared at him, but there was no further movement or words. Izuku looked at the items he had gathered up, biting his lip. Before him was a small pile of gifts he had selected. Now, though, he had a tough decision ahead of him. To give the gifts or not? Both Aizawa-sensei and Yamada-sensei told him that they would grade him fairly, even without gifts. That all the teachers of UA would. And if any teacher didn't, then Izuku could go to them, and they would straighten it out, even if it meant going to Nezu to fire the teacher who was mistreating him. He had ended up missing a week, not having been able to give gifts, and his grades hadn't seemed to suffer for it, so maybe they were right. It would only hurt his grades to try, right? If he was misgraded, he could always go back in returning to giving gifts. Or, if it was just one teacher, only give gifts to that one teacher. It wasn't like he wanted to bother Aizawa and Yamada-sensei. He already was using a lot of their generosity, and he didn't want them to get tired of him. But would they get tired of him? Everything so far pointed to no, but that was what he thought of Taro and Kaio at the time. Hindsight was 2020. Reaching for the gifts, he had picked one up, his backpack in his other hand, when he paused, then slowly put the planner down, which had been a gift for Cementos. He trusted Aizawa and Yamada-sensei. They wouldn't lead him astray. Making his decision, he closed his bag without putting any of the gifts inside. Glancing at the time, he saw it was getting late, so he took a shower, and after getting into his pajamas, laid on his bed, thinking of his classmates as he drifted off to sleep. He wasn't the only one that Aizawa-sensei helped, after all. Ida Tenya, currently the only person Izuku could call his friend. He had cut his bond with the boy, making it easier to trust him, but there was still that lingering fear that the mostly rule-abiding boy would turn out like Taro and Kaio. Anyways, Aizawa-sensei always made sure to have a juice box on hand, in case Ida pushed himself too far. For Uraraka Ochako, he didn't trust her nearly as much as Ida, but that was because she called him Deku. Really, it was his own fault that he didn't have the courage to ask her to stop. Otherwise, she seemed pretty nice. Aizawa-sensei had some pills on hand that would help her with her nausea. Tokiyami Fumikage. He was probably the next person Izuku might be willing to call a friend. The guy was mostly silent, but he was nice and did glare at anyone who tried to bother Izuku when he didn't feel like dealing with them. The glaring included their classmates. Well, to be more specific, it was Dark Shadow who was glaring while Tokiyami just gave them an empty stare with crossed arms. Todoroki Shoto. Izuku didn't really have much experience with him, besides for the event in Hosu. The recommendation student seemed pretty cold, though, and not just because of his quirk. Now, though, at least Izuku had a bit of a reason. even if he didn't know what to think of the information. Endeavor had never seemed purely obsessed with All Might, at least not to Izuku. The flame hero had always seemed focused on taking down villains and helping people. Izuku didn't live with him, though, so Todoroki would of course know more than Izuku did. Aizawa-sensei had heating pads in his belt that he would give Todoroki when he overused his ice. Asui Suyu, he didn't really like her, but he didn't dislike her. She had saved him when he fell into the water during the USJ attack, but she had also tried to insist on them being friends. Asui had apologized, so he didn't really know what to think of her, and her blunt statements. Aizawa-sensei would also end up giving her heating pads in case Asui got too cold during training. Ashido Mina, now he couldn't say he disliked her, but she did make him cower away a bit, mostly when she was trying to ask him for information. She was pretty intense. Luckily, she stopped when someone told her to. Now if only Izuku could tell her himself. Aoyama Yuga, the boy liked to speak in a mixture of Japanese and French, and offered to teach them some French after school. Izuku knew he had a small gathering, but he was a bit too nervous to go. Plus, he had been pretty busy after school. Izuku wanted to, one day. It would be nice to learn some French. The boy also liked to bring cheeses to class and offered them to anyone during the small break in between the second and third period when the teachers were switching classes. Kota Koji, now, he was a classmate Izuku feared. He knew logically that Kota was not Taro, but they looked so similar, and they both had animal-related quirks. They had to be related in some way. Kota seemed to realize that Izuku was scared of him, and kept his distance. Izuku was grateful for it, even if he felt guilty. One day, he silently promised he would talk to Kota and get to know the boy better. Aizawa-sensei had taken to signing with the boy occasionally, though Izuku didn't watch the conversation, not wanting to intrude. Kirishima Eijiro. The boy seemed pretty nice, but Izuku didn't really have the opportunity to get to know him, as Kirishima liked to hang around Bakugo, who of course Izuku did his best to avoid. Shoji Meizo. The taller boy was pretty nice. He didn't often talk much, but the boy almost seemed to have a sense for when Izuku's anxiety was getting the better of him, in hallways, and would use his arms to shield him away. Mineta Minoru. Izuku didn't like him, mostly because the boy had given off a similar vibe to... Well, point was Izuku didn't like him, but the boy did seem like he wanted to change his behavior after his attention with Midnight Sensei. Izuku hoped the boy was able to change and become a better person. Hagakure Toru. She seemed to be a bit like Ashido, wanting to know everything that was going on, but was a lot more subtle about it. Hagakure never pushed as much as Ashido, but was almost always standing next to her. Aizawa-sensei made sure to call on her every few days, or just show that he noticed her, which she seemed to appreciate. Sato Rikido, he always brought in a sweet dish on Fridays, which he handed out during lunch. Izuku hadn't had any other interactions with the boy, who seemed to keep to himself. Izuku wanted to one day talk to him. Yayorozu Momo, the class vice president. She seemed pretty nice, though her quirk was really amazing. She could create so many things, although recently the girl had been hanging out with that inventor girl who hacked the speakers during the sports festival, and there had been an increase in people following her around. She seemed to be becoming quite popular. Ojiro. The boy seemed to have held a grudge against Shinso as he glared at the purple-haired boy every time they passed by each other in the hall. Izuku had heard Ashido and Hagakure describe him as plain once, and the boy had heard and his tail had sunk down, his expression looking sad. Aizawa-sensei had moments later complimented him on his clever use of his quirk, which had cheered the boy up. Saruhanta, the boy with the tape quirk, was pretty amusing. He often had some sort of statement that would make the class crack up, but Izuku didn't really know him either, though he had noticed the boy feared sharp things, which is probably why he forfeited during the sports festival. Jiro Kyoka, another person he didn't know well. The only person she really seemed to interact with was Kaminari, and that was to insult him. She either didn't seem to notice or care that her words were hurting Kaminari's feelings. Izuku didn't really want to get to know her if she was going to be mean. Last but not least, there was Kaminari Denki. The boy seemed pretty nice and surprisingly funny, though he had issues focusing in class and he did seem hyper-focused on using his quirk in a certain way. Instead of figuring out different ways he could use his quirk. Electricity, which reminded Izuku of his own new quirk. Eyes widening, Izuku bolted up. He had forgotten to tell All Might about it. After all, the quirk wasn't from someone he bonded with, which meant somehow it had come from One for All. That theory was also supported by the fact that he had seen 8 other shades in that strange nightmare-like dream. It was a bit late, but hopefully All Might would see it soon. I need to talk with you about the quirk. Only a few minutes passed before his phone rang, revealing the caller was All Might. Answering it, All Might greeted him. "Hello, young Midoriya. You needed to talk." Y- yes, just. Uh, have you ever seen the previous users of the quirk in like a dream? Hmm. Ah, yes, something like that. We'll talk more during lunch Monday. I think it's time I told you the origin of the quirk. Uh, okay, I'll see you Monday then, Izuku said. Good night, young Midoriya, All Might said, and with that he hung up, leaving Izuku with a beeping tone. Ending the call himself, Izuku fell back down onto his bed. With a long breath, he closed his eyes and finally managed to fall asleep. All right, listeners, this concludes chapter 50 of Little Acts of Kindness. Chapter 51 will be up next. It's crazy to think we've already gotten through 50 chapters. I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions to this one. I like this chapter a lot. I like Izuku kind of detailing out his thoughts and feelings on each of his classmates like this. I also really like the snippet between Nomuri and Tensei at the beginning. And probably my favorite part, outside of the fact that we're going to see more conversations between All Might and Midoriya coming in the future here, is the fact that when Izuku's talking about his classmates, he's relaying all of the little things that Aizawa does to support them as well. So I think that's really great. So let me know your overall thoughts and reactions to this chapter. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.